in partnership with the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification and the Women's Federation for World Peace, the Washington Times Foundation, and the Sege Times. We gather at this time to honor the life and legacy of my beloved husband, Reverend Dr. Sun Myung Moon, who ascended to the spiritual world 2 years ago. On this second anniversary of his samhain, I have commissioned a wide range of programs such as the World Summit, not only to pay tribute to my husband and the providential work we have carried out over the many years, but to blaze a trail towards the fulfillment of God's providence. I pray that we can work together to achieve this goal, which has been the hope of all ages and the hope of God. At the time of our Holy Blessing ceremony in 1960s, amidst a handful of followers gathered in a humble house located not far from here, my husband and I pledged before God, our Heavenly Parent, to work day and night until our dying breath to build a world of peace and prosperity for all. I vividly remember that day as if it were yesterday. My husband and I have brought together by heavenly providence for a sacred mission. As we began our marriage, we felt great hope and at the same time a sense of overwhelming responsibility. God alone does not control the events or outcomes of human history. Rather, God seeks to find and raise up individuals who understand and follows heaven's will. The progress of God's providence requires that each individual, and especially central figures, fulfill their own portion of responsibility. Those who often take the path realize its steep, treacherous, and painful difficulty. Neither my husband nor I were naive or unaware of the challenges we would face. On the other hand, we experienced directly the love, guidance, and protection of our Heavenly Parent in the most intimate and powerful ways. And this inspired our absolute faith, commitment, and determination. On the other hand, we also encountered extraordinary opposition and obstruction that defied rational explanation and which can only be called demonic. The forces of good and evil were ever present and palpable. Korea itself was a battleground. We each had first-hand experience of humiliation of colonial rule and the horrors of war right here on this peninsula, which to this day remains divided. Forced to flee from our hometowns when a dictatorial communist regime took control of the territory of the 38th parallel, neither of us were able to live in the cherished homes of our birth, among family, friends, and relatives. As we started out our mission, Korea was a nation emerging from a devastating conflict, with our people still mourning the tragic loss of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. Korea was then a small, impoverished country, known to many as a hermit kingdom. Our church headquarters was at that time about the size of a single hotel room. Our followers were few, and our resources meager. And if this were not enough, we faced prejudice, slander, and persecution from the established political and religious authorities. And yet, by the grace of God, our movement grew and grew and grew. And who could have predicted that what is now a respected global movement known throughout the world for its vision, principles, and best practices could have arisen out of the ashes of war, abject poverty, and unfair persecution. God works in mighty and mysterious ways. The essential ideal that has guided and sustained our work through thick and thin over so many difficult years is that God is truly our Heavenly Parent, and we are all sons and daughters of one God, one family under God. All our effort and numerous peace organizations that were founded over the many years have been entirely dedicated to the fulfillment of that vision. By the grace of God, and through the blood, sweat, and tears of countless members, this vision is now blossoming like a flower of hope in the midst of a world otherwise that seems on the brink of disaster. Although it may appear that we are about to enter an era that resembles the Dark Ages, we are actually on the threshold of a new era of peace. If only we respond to God's call. The World Summit is itself a response to God's call. Our world faces a multitude of challenges, from climate change and poverty, to geopolitical tension, terrorism, interreligious conflict, from family breakdown and crime to moral and spiritual confusion. I am sure you may encounter many of these same challenges in your own nations and regions, in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Eurasia, and in Oceania. These problems cannot be solved through the instruments of government alone, for their root cause is not exclusively political or economic in nature. Rather, the root cause is buried deep in the human heart, in selfishness and separation from God. Ladies and gentlemen, for the sake of our nations and the world, we must open our hearts and minds to receive the guidance of God, our Heavenly Parent. Respected leaders, in accordance with God's will, my husband and I spent over 5 decades during the prime of our lives dedicating ourselves and our family to bringing about a spiritual and moral awakening as a foundation for global transformation. Spiritual and moral principles do not exist for their own sake. Their purpose is to form the basis of life in this world. That is, these divine principles are to infuse all sectors of society, including not only religion, but the spheres of government, trade, commerce, education, academia, the media, culture, and the arts, and most importantly, family life. Respected leaders, the substantial foundation my husband and I established did not come about magically or by some stroke of luck. It requires total commitment, unceasing effort, alignment with God's providence, and investment in all sectors, from the grassroots to centers of cultural, religious, economic, and political power. Consider the following areas where we have applied this principle. God created the family as a school of love. In accordance with God's principle of creation, the family is the most fundamental and necessary of all human institutions. Without it, humanity can't survive as a species. When it fails, the society, nation, and world fail. When we restore the health of marriage and family, centered on God, we can restore the world. My husband and I have worked to achieve this goal through the marriage blessing movement. As you may know, millions of couples from around the world have participated in the blessing, affirming their marriage and commitment to build a world of peace by creating God-centered, ideal families. We have encouraged young men and women to consider international, interreligious, or interracial marriage. Through such families, we can promote reconciliation and help bring the world into unity. In 1996 in Washington, D.C., as an outgrowth of the Unification Church and in accordance with God's will, we founded the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification as a global movement dedicated to nurturing and strengthening healthy, stable, God-centered families as the building blocks of a harmonious and prosperous world. We were honored that former U.S. Presidents George Herbert Walker Bush and Gerald Ford, as well as the former United Kingdom Prime Minister Edward Heath, attended the founding assembly. Since that time, FFWPU has actively promoting and expanding this vision in 194 nations. Among 7 billion people, well over 2/3 are religious. These great civilizations throughout history have endured due to their religious and spiritual foundations. Religion has always called us to examine the deeper, underlying reality of our existence, to turn our eyes, our hearts, and our minds toward heaven, and to listen to those who have been sent by heaven to this earth. However, while called into being by God's direct intervention, religions and religious believers often stray from the true path. As such, we witness a dark side of religion, expressed in narrow sectarianism, extremism, bigotry, and triumphalism. These devastations have led to serious disunity and even conflict amongst believers of various religions. This reality, the will of heaven, this reality undermines the will of heaven and breaks the heart of God. That is why a movement to bring together leaders and believers from all spiritual traditions in mutual respect and cooperation is so important. For more than 50 years, we have invested more of our resources in ecumenical and interfaith dialogue than in our own church. It is that important. Our efforts in the Middle East, and especially the Holy Land, are carried out by UPF and EPI, and date back to my husband's visit there in 1965. At that time, he dedicated the holy ground near the Garden of Gethsemane, and a sincere prayer for the unity amongst Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He cried out to God and to Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad. Since that day, not a year has passed without serious investment being made to promote harmony and cooperation among religions, and even amongst the various sects that are often disunited within each religious tradition. In the year 2000, Father Moon and I spoke at the United Nations calling for the UN to establish an interreligious council. This council would fill the gap at the United Nations, serving as a Senate or an upper house of spiritual and moral leaders. The members of this council would be expected to rise above sectarian or partisan interests and advocate for the good of the whole human family and not merely one nation or religion. The following year, when the terrorists attacked the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, we responded immediately by convening 4 weeks after the attacks a major international interfaith conference in New York City aimed at stopping the spread of violence. At that time, we conferred with Muslim leaders and planned a series of Muslim summits to promote peace. Similar initiatives have been carried out over several decades in a variety of places where interreligious discord feeds the potential for conflict. Just as international corruption and hostile relations amongst religions stands in the way of lasting peace, the same problems plague the relations among nation-states. When the Cold War came to an end 25 years ago, we thought perhaps a new millennium of peace would emerge. However, we see that many obstacles remain standing in the way. The Middle East is now on fire with conflict. The crisis in Ukraine threatens the stability of international order. East Asia is faced with continuous threats, including increased militarization, complex disputes over island territories, and the nuclear weapons program in North Korea. Although the programs of UPF, WFWP, and other organizations, we have been actively engaging in seeking to resolve these conflicts, offering soft power alternatives to hard power politics, aggression, and open conflict. For example, we have been convening over many years a series of programs aimed at promoting peace in Northeast Asia. As a counterpart to MEPI, we call this series the Northeast Asia Peace Initiative. We hold these programs continuously in Korea as well as in Japan, the US, and recently in Vladivostok, Russia. Future programs are being considered for China, Mongolia, and even North Korea. Through dialogue, we can build trust and mutual respect and break down the barriers that stand in the way of cooperation. During the Cold War, my husband and I straightforwardly opposed communist ideology, which advocated violent revolution, limited freedoms, and atheism. Our opposition to communism was based on an affirmation of religious freedom, limited government, rule of law, and open markets. These ideals were expressed through the organizations we founded in 1980 called CAUSA. We also convened an important international conference in Geneva in 1985, sponsored by the Professors World Peace Academy, to discuss the imminent decline of the Soviet Union and the need to prepare for a post-Soviet world. We never closed the door to dialogue. We made every effort to meet with the leaders of the Soviet Union and North Korea. In 1990, we held a summit in Moscow with the support and participation of President Mikhail and Raisa Gorbachev. We did everything we could to promote a smooth transition from communism to democracy in Russia. We placed a strong emphasis on good governance, character education for the youth, and strengthening of civil society and religious freedom. In 1991, we traveled to North Korea to meet President Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of North Korea's current leader, Kim Jong-un. Despite our aversion to North Korean policies, including assassination attempts on my husband's life, we embraced President Kim and urged him to open up the borders to dialogue, economic cooperation, and people-to-people exchange through sports, arts, tourism, and humanitarian relief efforts. We have invested enormous resources in North Korea in order to reduce the tensions and build trust that is necessary for peaceful reunification. Over several decades, we invested in the Americas, and especially in the United States. Our love for America was not based on nationalism or a lack of awareness of its flaws, but rather it was based on an understanding of America's unique position and responsibility in the world. The United States, as a leading nation of the free world, represents the ideals of freedom, religious liberty, human rights, democratic governance, and rule of law. Many countries around the world have admired and emulated the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. America was blessed by God and was called on a sacred mission. But with that blessing came great responsibility. The responsibility to share that blessing and to serve other nations in order to establish a world of true love and lasting peace. Unfortunately, beginning in the 1960s, many people in the United States began to lose sight of that truth. We began to see the spread of drug abuse, free sex, individualism, and materialism. Thus began a trend towards spiritual and moral decline. Beginning with our arrival in the United States in 1971, my husband and I sought to bring about a great awakening through grassroots movements dedicated to spiritual and moral renewal. My husband always said that God had called on us to serve in a role of a doctor or a firefighter. We had come to heal the nation and to put out the fire of selfishness and corruption. The United States has lost its way and needed to rekindle the God-centered spirit that had prevailed at the time of its founding. This was a message that my husband and I conveyed to Presidents Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, and Bush, and to hundreds of members of Congress in the U.S. Capitol, and to many millions of ordinary Americans from every religion, race, and cultural background. In April 2008, my husband and I convened the America Summit in Washington, D.C., under the sponsorship of UPF and dedicated to the theme towards a new paradigm of leadership and good governance for the development of peace in the Americas. Former President George Herbert Walker Bush and former Uruguayan President Julio Maria Sanguinetti made substantial contributions to the success of this important meeting. My husband and I encouraged both of these leaders to work for the unity of America. In Jardim, Brazil, we established the ideal family education headquarters for world peace and attracted people from around the world who aspired to create an ideal community. We also established a farm there called New Hope Farm and invited people to come there to work the land, to live together and learn with the people from around the world. Thus began a movement to build a model, ideal community in harmony with the environment. In the Pantanal region as well, centering on Puerto Leda in the Paraguay River Basin, we have worked to build an ideal village with international volunteers living and working together in harmony with nature. We established a farm there with a vision of developing resources for the benefit of the people of the world. In addition, we launched a fish farming project. Fish farming is necessary because in the future, it will be difficult to supply enough fish from what can be harvested from the open sea. In May of last year, we were successful in raising our first batch of pacu. We were honored at that time with a visit from the Paraguayan President, Federico Franco, and other government officials. Many other major oceanic fishery and boat-building initiatives have been undertaken over the past 40 years, from Kodiak, Alaska, to Antarctica, and from Yosu, Korea, to Gloucester, Massachusetts. Proper stewardship and care for the environment is absolutely essential at this time. Climate change, rising sea levels, deforestation, desertification, a lack of clean water supply, malnutrition, and rising cost of food products require our immediate attention. God created us to love and care for this earth and all its blessings. Korean people have a great respect for the United Nations. Of course we are proud that Mr. Ban Ki-moon is the UN Secretary General. But more importantly, it was the United Nations that intervened to save the nation at the time of the Korean War. True Father, my husband, was liberated by UN forces in 1950 from Hunnan prison camp in North Korea. where he was about to be executed. I, along with my husband, have spoken at the United Nations